Hey guys, welcome back to World of Tanks with that red guy. Today I'm reviewing the E-100 Super Heavy. And now you may be asking yourself why I'm reviewing one of the oldest tanks in the game, especially when basically every other YouTuber has said their piece on the matter. Well, I have two reasons. One, the E-100 is my second most played tank in the game, so it's the one that I have the most knowledge about. And two, most of those tank guides from them are about 3 to 4 years old because this tank has been in the game for so long. So I thought an updated E-100 guide would help everyone, especially newer players trying to get into the game. If you guys stick around, I'll be rating the E-100 in a tier list that we'll continue to expand on as I do more and more tank reviews. So let's see what the E-100 rates up and stacks up as, and I'll tell you right now, it's not going to be S tier. Let's get stuck in. Alright, so let's look more at the general characteristics of this tank, because it's important to talk, I think, mostly with the armor and gun relative, but let's see how the other factors are playing on this vehicle before we get to talk about those factors. Well, mobility is an important feature of any tank, but for super heavies, it's not nearly as important. Thankfully, though, the E-100 is kind of a limber super heavy. It has a pretty good top speed of 30 kilometers an hour and a really great 15 kilometer an hour backward speed. This thing is quick to get in and out of corners and engagements. You will actually find using this tank in and out of these situations, it feels pretty fast for what it is. I mean, it's a 130-ton behemoth. This thing is massive, and if it hits you at even relatively its close speed, most other tanks just blow up, right? Its traverse speed of 25.44 is 25.44 degrees a second. It's pretty good. You'll actually find that's a lot better than a lot of other slower vehicles. So again, we're seeing mobility is a pretty good factor here. If you compared it to a mouse, it's quite a bit more mobile. So when we look at the mouse to the E-100, they're both considered super heavy, but the mouse is more armor focused and the E-100 is more gun focused. And again, we'll talk more about the gun. Obviously, concealment is not important to this vehicle, and it is awful, so don't expect to be hiding at any point in any battle from your enemies. And that's important. You have armor, let's use it, right? Spotting is pretty good. 440. I'm not really made this crew super specialized for spotting. I do have situational awareness and recon coming through. Once recon goes all the way through, I'm actually pretty sure this thing will be as close to max. I think it'll be 2 off maybe. Actually, no, it should be right on the money max view range without having to really work for it. So that's a really nice key feature. Overall, the tank is a pretty good compromise. It's flexible as a super heavy tank. It can get around the battlefield pretty well, and those are really nice features to have. But we'll see when it compares to the 60TP, it is just ever so slightly worse. I mean, the 60TP has a better power to weight ratio, much better actually. It has a better overall top speed of 35 kilometers an hour. So again, it's important to understand that within a echo chamber, the E-100's mobility seems pretty good, but when you compare it to, let's say, a 60TP, it seems a little worse. So let's get into talking about the gun next, yeah? Let's talk about the gun for a second, because it is probably the most distinctive feature on the tank. It has a 150mm 750 alpha damage Omega cannon that puts the E-100 as one of the highest alpha damage heavies in the game. The only other heavy with 750 alpha are going to be the 60TP and the VK 7002K. I don't really count the VK because it's a Clan Wars reward vehicle, and it's not going to be accessible to most players. So really, at tier 10, the 60TP is the only other heavy tank that the E-100 is going to be facing with the same alpha. This alpha damage allows this tank to trade 1-to-1 basically with all other vehicles in the game. If you want to beat an E-100, you can't trade with it because it will absolutely smack you. But for those trades to be effective, it needs to pen. And this is where we start to get into a problem with the E-100 because its standard shell sucks. Not only is the gun pretty inaccurate with a base accuracy of 0.39, which you can bring down to 0.37 with Crew Skills, Brothers in Arms, and Vents, but it also only has a base pen of 247mm. That is really, really not great for a tier 10 heavy tank. Most tier 10 heavies have around 260 to 270, and that allows them to really punish other heavy tanks more. This tank really can't, though. There's a lot of tanks, like, for instance, the Object 705A. Its lower plate is around 260, 270 effective, and this tank just doesn't have that kind of pin. Add on top of this, the fact that this tank has a 757 meter a second gun velocity, the shells sort of lob out of the tank, which means this tank can't snipe very effectively at all. And against the new wheelie boys, you know, the wheeled light tanks that have been in the game, this tank struggles to shoot those guys because the shells basically get outran by that really fast tank. It means that While this tank on paper has a really awesome chance to be very dominant, the standard shell really holds it back. It is made up for, however, and the fact that if you press your 2 key and you pay several thousand more credits per shot, you go from 247mm pin to 330mm pin. So when you play this tank, you're going to be expecting to fire a lot of premium. There's just too many cases where it matters. There's so many vehicles, like even if you're fighting another E-100, you have no chance of dealing with his armor unless you fire your gold rounds. Thankfully, however, though, even though the gold rounds are very useful, this tank does come well equipped with really good HE as well. So if you're not willing to spend a ton of money on your gold rounds, you still have a really solid HE shell to back it up. It has 950 alpha and can generally do around 200 to 300 damage regardless of the enemy, but I find it does more like 400 average per shot. It's also toting the E-100 is 50 shells in its capacity. This allows it to have a potential damage in-game of 37,000. This is huge. It means that you have plenty of room for all the gold shells you'll ever need, plus a ton of HE and a ton of standard rounds. So this tank will never be without ammunition, and I think the game is better for it. But speaking of armor and how you need heat shells to pin another E-100, let's talk about that for a second. Welcome to Tanks GG, guys. I would look at this tank's armor in-game, but World of Tanks doesn't have an in-game armor editor, so we're going to have to sort of go to external resources. And if you guys can see right here, what I've loaded this Tanks GG against is it's firing against its standard round, which only, as we said, has 247mm of armor. Now the upper plate on this tank is incredibly effective. As you guys can see, even unangled, it's around 350, 300mm effective everywhere. I'll be honest, at this point in time in the game, everyone and their brother knows not to shoot at this thing's upper plate. You will never pin it. Even, I would say a Jagdpanzer E-100 could probably bounce this shell with its heat round pretty consistently at certain angles, because again, as you angle this tank, this plate becomes incredibly effective. So that's one plus right now. As a super heavy tank, this has one of the thickest and most effective upper plates out of any vehicle, and that's really good. The lower plate, however, is traditionally very bad, and as you guys can see here, it's around 240, 230 effective, which, yeah, I mean, you only have a 60% chance of pinning it with your AP rounds, but that's not awful, right? That's still pretty good. And it means that low tier tanks, generally, if you just sort of angle at them sort of like this, they're going to really struggle to pin you, even with some of their best premium rounds, because they may be tempted to shoot your side here. And again, you guys can see how much of an angle on the side we can put out before it really starts to pin. So you have a really effective frontal hull armor. And so right now it looks pretty good. And the same situation with the turret. If you guys can see, the turret is actually the thickest part of the armor on this vehicle. It's 250mm, but the angle of it is only 30 degrees. It's barely sloped back. I mean, as you guys can see right here, it doesn't really have a very steep angle. If it was sort of sloped back more at an extreme angle, sort of like this tank would probably be Krongbong turret impenetrable, but it's not. And so what it means is that this tank is around 280 effective. So that's really good against, like I said, tier 8s and tier 9s are going to struggle to pin your turret even flat and angled on. But here's where the situation is going to change for the E-100 significantly. What I've done here is I've pressed heat shell for this tank specifically. Heat shell with 330mm of pin. Look at this. All this green is essentially, I think, an 80% or a higher chance to pin. That means 8 out of 10 times, if they shoot this, they are going to pin. And that's a huge percentage chance to pin. I mean, like, there's a lot of tanks that don't have that. And so you're now realizing the main issue with this tank. It's its massive, flat, 250mm turret that is so easy to pin with tier 10 premium rounds. You will find, when you play this tank, people will shoot one AP round at you, and then they will immediately switch over to heat, because guess what? It's super effective. You basically turn a tank that, look, you didn't have any chance of really pinning effectively, to a tank that, look, you have a great chance of pinning. I mean, again, the upper plate is still very, very effective, and you should always never shoot at it. But the lower plate becomes super easy to pin, even easier than the turret, and same thing, the turret becomes incredibly... I mean, this is huge. This tank is massive. Remember, this is a huge tank. This turret is so easy to, like, fire and hit. Even at distance, you can hit this thing. So this is the key problem with E-100. It is slow, its gun is very ineffective in some cases, and it's so easy to pin if you're willing to fire gold. And that's what you're having to fight against. That is the key gameplay characteristic of playing an E-100. It is trying to figure out how to get people to not bounce on your turret, or how to get people to bounce on your turret, I mean. So the most obvious thing is just to angle your armor, right? So if you angle your turret here, you put the effective armor up to around 320, 330. And as you guys can see, just by turning your tank like 10 to 50 degrees a little bit to a different direction, so that the side armor is still very effective. As you guys can see, if we make the side armor any more effective, we will make it an easy pin, because you guys can see we just turned a little bit. So this is about as far as you could push it. I'd say this is probably a really safe angle. But here's the interesting thing, right? You see, if we turn our turret like this, now the turret is a much more interesting of a dilemma, because most of this turret cheek is now covered by your mantlet, and you are not going through this mantlet. It is incredibly thick. This part of the turret, you have a 30 to 40% chance, 50. So really the best bet here would be to shoot the side, but again, it's not really great. You only have about a 50-50 chance now. So what you have to do with this tank is you have to side scrape. So like, let's say I brought in a handy dandy calculator here, and let's say you want to side scrape here. So let's say this is my building. If this was the angle that someone had saw right here, right? They are only seeing around 340, 350 effective. And so even with their heat, they're going to struggle. If they shoot your sides, they're automatically bounce. I mean, look at that effective armor. It's a 1400, okay? They're never going to pin that. But the effective turret armor is so good here that really the only weak point that you guys are going to see now is just going to be this little flat bar that falls up on the tank. And so that flat bar, if you know what you're doing, is a really good way to pin this tank, because regardless of how you angle the turret, that flat bar is there. And if you're really up close and you're an experienced player, you'll know to shoot that. Actually, another little known weak point of the E-100 is you see this observation bar up here. If you have, like it says, 200 millimeters of pin, you can actually shoot this thing. And so let's say you got an E-100 at something like, just seeing its turret. So let's bring back the calculator. Let's say this is all you see of the tank. This is a very pinnable aspect of it, and is really easy to pin with even a tier 8 gun. Most tier 7s could probably pin that, actually, if they started firing gold. So a little known weak point. This is actually the weakest armor presented on the vehicle, and it's there basically all the time. So the armor means for this tank then that gameplay is focused on angling and hiding the majority of your hull, so you're going to be side scraping a lot, and only turning your turret when you know it's safe to fire. Because again, if you don't angle your turret, remember, if we don't leave our turret at like an angle like this, and let's say we just turn our turret to face the gun, we go from having a 30 to 40% chance of pinning, which again is still pretty high, to having basically almost 100% chance to pin. I mean, this is pretty dang effective. Like, we're gonna pin this all day. Okay. So that's sort of where this is, the reason why this tank is considered very unpopular and very frustrating, because there's a point in this vehicle where it feels like you can't ever bounce anything, especially when people really get into firing their premium rounds. And let's put against a really, really bad case here. Like, let's compare it against a tank that has incredibly good penetration, like, I don't know, an E3 firing APCR. Look at how this tank changes in its turret. You have almost a 95% chance of pinning the E-100's turret. You see right there, there's a 100% chance of pinning it right there. Okay? And again, that is just incredible. So, it doesn't really matter how you angle this turret now, because if you guys can see, that's an auto ricochet, that's not a ricochet, and it's just all green. So, a problem with the E-100 is just that regardless of what you do, sometimes it feels like there is no way for you to bounce shells. So let's talk a little bit about how this armor compares to the 60 TP, which I think is its greatest competitor. We're going to make a quick comparison there, and then we're going to try to put this thing in tier lists and maybe look at some gameplay. So let's get to it. I think right now is a really good time to stop and compare the 60 TP to the E-100. I think a lot of people straight away, when they look at the difference between the 60 TP and the E-100, they say, listen, the 60 TP is the good one, and the E-100 is sort of been power creeped by this tank. And I disagree for a few reasons. But if you look at it on paper, the 60 TP is a much more usable tank. One, it does not have that giant turret weakness that I've been explaining in the armor. It just doesn't. It's a much more effective turret design, and it does bounce a lot more off its turret. It also has slightly better base pin, slightly better accuracy of 0.02, and it also has a much more improved shell velocity of almost 960. It's also slightly more mobile, has only 100 less HP, and generally is just a better tank. Has 1 degree extra gun depression, for instance. But there's a few things that make the 60 TP not an obvious top tier pick over the E-100, and that is its armor profile on the hull. The front hull of the 60 TP generally looks better because look at its lower glacis. It's very small, but what happens though is the hull armor is very easily pinned by gold shells, sort of like an opposite of the E-100. The E-100's turret was very easily pinned by gold shells, but the hull was not, whereas it's sort of opposite. The 60 TP's turret isn't very much so affected by gold, but definitely the hull armor is. The entire upper plate becomes pretty easy to pin because you can shoot either the driver's hatch, or if you see this sloping on the sides, if you try to angle to the left or to the right at all, a lot of tanks can just straight up pin the side of your armor. And that armor is only around 200 millimeters effective, so it's really, really bad for you to angle this tank. So it becomes a point of, you can play hull down in this vehicle, sort of like the E-100 can side scrape, but the second you expose your hull armor in any sort of meaningful way, you're going to have something exposed. And unlike the E-100 where you could actually sort of duck into cover for a little bit, this tank, you're always going to be exposing some sort of weak point. I also want to say that I find that the 60 TP's dispersion values, how the reticle blooms over time, is actually much worse than the E-100. I know on paper it doesn't say it is, but I think it may be because the turret rotates faster and that the tank is just generally faster, and that is why the reticle seems to bloom out, because I've put a ton of modules and cruise skills and everything trying to get the turret and the bloom to stay more focused, whereas with the E-100 I feel like I can drive around and the reticle doesn't bloom very much. So I think that's really an interesting thing. Let's actually talk a little bit further about how this bloom and dispersion are being affected in a little test. Alright guys, I just finished my testing for this problem and I think I have a pretty good result. So the test involves taking both tanks on the same map. I took them on ints because it was small and me and my friend were shooting some other video. And I basically just took the E-100 and the 60 TP and turned their turret to the left, both of them to 90 degrees, so off the left hand side, and tried to bring the guns back to the center. And I sort of keyed out the frame so that right as the reticle hits the center, that's when our test starts. So I have a timer going at the top. The left side is going to be the E-100, the right side will be the 60 TP, and you'll see the red timers. Now, something to note about the timers is that they're not time accurate. They're just going to give us a relative scale of comparison. So it doesn't take, I think it'll say the 60 TP takes 7 seconds. That's not true. It's just because I slowed down the footage so you actually have more time to sort of take in what's going on. So take a look on the left. You can see the E-100 is going to complete this in around 4.5 and the 60 TP is going to take it in 7.45. So what does this mean? It means, I think, a couple things. One, obviously the dispersion values for the 60 TP are better, and if you guys can look at the reticles, they are smaller. The 60 TP's reticle is smaller than the E-100's because the accuracy is better, right? But what this means, I think, in practice, though, is that when you're trying to shoot at tanks, you have to have a bit more confidence in your shots than you probably do in the E-100, because with the E-100, you'll notice that you will see the reticle sort of stay more centered. And I think it's because the accuracy is worse, but the dispersion values are relatively the same as the 60 TP. I think another reason is the 60 TP's turret turns a lot faster, and so when you turn your tank faster, it actually makes the dispersion go out wider. So I think those are the reasons why this happens. So my test is correct. I don't think it necessarily means the 60 TP is like less accurate, but I definitely do think my observations were true, and I hopefully proved them to you guys. So let's get to a conclusion. Let's rate this E-100. Let's put it on the tier list, and let's make some final remarks about the E-100 altogether. Alright, so let's make a conclusion about the E-100. I think the E-100 is one of those tanks that is going to really piss people off when they play it, mainly because its armor is so frustrating to use. No matter how much you try to angle it, no matter how much you work on it, it just feels like the tank has issues. And I think that this vehicle really needs some help, like updates and patches. And I do think that the help is coming. If you guys have seen my previous videos on Balance Update 2.0 and the changes that are being made to premium shells in general are going to become a lot less viable, I think. So that's a great meta for the E-100. And with HP buffs coming as well, the E-100 gets a huge extra amount of HP coming if they're not going to change anything, of about 600 extra HP. So that meta I think is going to play a lot better for the E-100. But as the meta is in now in 1.7.1, the tank roster is so aggressively against the E-100. I think genuinely this tank is below average. It's not trash, it can work, but it really does struggle against a lot of vehicles. And as we talked about a comparison with the 60 TP, that means this tank really does like have some really direct competition. And I do think that the 60 TP is average for this tier, and I think the E-100 is below average. So the 60 TP is becoming C tier, and the E-100 is now D tier. When I do review the 60 TP in more depth, I may adjust this up once I look more at the characteristics, but I feel pretty solid in my choice in doing that because I have played both tanks, and the comparison between them has really made me realize the 60 TP in basically 80% of all cases is just a better vehicle to be in versus the E-100. The only case that I would say that I would rather be in an E-100 is when I'm in a side scrape against low tier vehicles or vehicles that aren't going to be spamming gold, because even your side scrape against gold spamming people is pretty difficult. It generally just means you can't ever point your gun at them, because if you ever present your gun directly at them, they're just going to shoot the sides of your turrets because you've just sort of flattened them out for you. So I think that's all I'm going to say about the E-100 in this video. Make sure you guys leave a comment. Tell me, do you guys agree? Is D tier the perfect place for the 100, or should it be somewhere higher, or should it be in trash tier? Let me know, and I'll see you guys on the next one.